Okay, now it's time to start with the second panel, with the second event, translating gods into politics, contemporary challenges, which means we are now actually somehow traveling through time, and this panel is going to be focused on current contemporary challenges, mostly in Southeastern Europe. So, first of all, I would like to thank the Center for the Study of Europe and for organizing this event with along with the Department of World Languages and Literatures and the CURA Institute, and the Center for the Study of Asia for making this happen. So I have three outstanding scholars to speak about contemporary challenges. In fact, the first of them, Professor Ayşe Parla, is going to actually provide her thoughts, comments, and observation on the lecture that we have just heard. Then from there on, we are going to proceed with Professor Prodromou and Professor Aimee Genell to speak about what the title of the panel is. I just want to kindly remind you that if you want to stick to the time frame, then please don't go over 15 minutes. And I will, I will be presently pushy, which means I will not tell you right away to stop. But if I see that you continue, then I will find a way to give you a sign that maybe it's time to somehow make concluding remarks. So what I want, in fact, is to appreciate the audience, because if we speak long, then you will not have time to pose questions. I want you to be in a reading role at the end. Cherry comes at the end, so therefore I have to reserve at least half an hour for audience. And if I need to actually sacrifice my comments at the end, I will do that gladly to give you a chance to speak and to pose questions. So, when it comes to contemporary politics and translating gods into politics, nothing new on this planet. There have been a number of not thousands of examples how religion was weaponized, politicized for political purposes. Before turning to the first panelist, I just want to make a quote of, I cannot call him my favorite theorist, but definitely one that at least we who teach international relations should keep in mind. Machiavelli once said that it is useful for politicians to appear religious. So therefore, you can see examples anywhere, and nothing has changed since his time. So first, in this panel to deliver her statement or her lecture is Professor Ayşe Parla. Let me briefly introduce you. Ayşe, she is Associate Professor and Provost Faculty Fellow for Graduate Academic Programs and Policies. Her areas of study include political anthropology, migration and citizenship, anthropology of emotions, a very interesting topic, I would say, hope and vengeance. This is also an interesting topic. Gender moralities, precarity and privilege, genocide, and dispossession. So her first book, Precarious Hope, explores the limits of belonging in Turkey from the perspective of Turkish migrants from Bulgaria who are ethnically privileged by economically precarious, for whom citizenship is promised even if not guaranteed. Her current project turns to post-genocide dispossession of Armenians in Turkey, something which is very much related to the first lecture, and the legalization and cultural normalization of that dispossession. Ayşe, floor is yours. So, do you need a mic?
I don't like that.
Okay.
I just need to switch it on. There we go. Okay. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Vesko. And I will try to be mindful of the time by keeping watch myself, but feel free to.
It won't be so drastic.
Okay, I'm prepared for it to be drastic. So in my remarks to follow, I will situate Dr. Ekmekçioğlu's riveting and harrowing lecture within the broader context of the centennial commemorations of the Turkish Republic. Following that, I will make a brief attempt to contextualize the lecture within Dr. Ekmekçioğlu's extensive and enormously impactful body of scholarship. To conclude, I will offer a couple of provocations in the spirit of our existing deep intellectual comradeship, for which I am grateful every day. Hence, the switch throughout the talk between calling Lerna, and Professor Ekmekçioğlu. So, throughout the weekend, in Turkey, as well as its transnational spaces, the streets, the skies, smartphone screens, which seems to be the emergent public space arena par excellence for ritualized commemoration, were awash with the Turkish national flag, immersed in displays of jubilant patriotic pride, including, yet again, the deification of Kemal Atatürk, probably my only reference to the title of the second panel, Turkey's founding father, with a surge of proclamations of citizens' readiness to lay down their lives for the nation, for its republican ideals, and some even simply for Atatürk's iconic blue eyes. This nationalist fervor permeated not just the political center or right, but it swept through the progressive, highly educated elite with some of the greatest cultural and social capital as well. Now, ostentatious expressions of loyalty and sacrifice are not a novel trope within Turkey's hegemonic political and affective culture. Yet, the surge in intensity is not solely due to the centennial's symbolic weight. It is also because, we suspect, such unconditional reclamations of the Republic and of Atatürk have become the predominant mode of dissent in today's deeply fractured society. So positioning oneself as an unconditional guardian of the Republic and its founding values, and being steeped in nostalgia for a perceived golden era prior to the AK Party reign, has emerged as the dominant, in fact, perhaps only permissible stance to oppose the current government's authoritarian, conservative, pro-Islamic rule. So there was hardly any space to engage in a nuanced and balanced assessment of the gains and losses of the Republic in the past century. There was no place to pose questions such as, for example, what of the claim of democracy if the Turkish Republic has seen 5 military interventions since 1923, with 2 of those being full-fledged coups d'etats, each with the purported goal of preventing what the Turkish army deemed to be deviations from the precepts of Kemalism. What of the promise of secularism if Kemalist ideology never really abandoned Sunni Islam, but has always stuck to that distinction we heard cited in Dr. Ekmekçioğlu's lecture with the definition of our native real name citizens, öz vatandaşlar, as those who are Muslims of Hanefi sect and speak Turkish. Also, recall the scandal a few years ago when it was revealed by accident that members of legally designated minorities had been secretly marked in classified government records, Greeks as number 1, Armenians with the code 2, and Jews with the code 3, called the secret race code. And what if the policing of the borders of how to be properly Muslim, which in the 90s meant that girls with headscarves were not allowed on university campuses and thrown out of classes in certain instances by some of their secular professors? What of the trumpeting of Turkey as being a civic nationalism if citizenship was always based on a hierarchy of otherness? The Kurds as Sunni Muslim, troublesome, but assimilable, but were denied recognition as a separate ethnicity until 1990 and were referred in official parlance as Mountain Turks. And where non-Muslims could only survive by agreeing to the terms of belonging imposed on them, which necessitated unending displays of devotion, as Dr. Ekmekçioğlu has forcefully shown in a prior article, in order to sidestep the ever-looming sword of accusations of treason and treachery, and thus constantly have to enact and embody loyalty in ways that anthropologist Paul Silverstein has called performative citizenship. So for almost a decade, between 2005 and 2015, political dissidents and critical scholarship were beginning to make some dents in this nationalist cosmology that defines authentic belonging exclusively in ethnic Turkish and Sunni Islam religious terms. But the slender chance for a nuanced examination of the Republic's record now seems, at least for the moment, quite out of reach. But perhaps it never really stood a solid chance if we center the genocide as foundational violence and Turkey's denial of it to this day. So even if we acknowledge that the Republic resulted, and it did, in certain gains for a secular educated segment of society, it never really provided a safe space for the survivors of the genocide to flourish and perpetuated overtly and covertly the policies of displacement and dispossession that the genocide had set in motion. So the question Dr. Ekmekçioğlu poses, what to the Armenian is the 29th of October, pushes the limits of the sayable and the thinkable at a moment when the already constricted arena for critical discourse is experiencing further contraction. And let me be clear, that shrinkage is not just due to the oppressive suppression of speech and dissent by the ruling authoritarian government, but also because of the ways in which the opposition polices the lines of dissent, deeming critique of the Republic either too harsh or too much, or in its most generous guise, perhaps fair, but not timely. This is not to do it. Your Turkey, my Lausanne. To me, this is no less than a set of ontological provocations as to how to survive, how to be in the land of genocide, when official denial is embraced by the overwhelming majority of the society. How does one reconcile on a daily basis with the constant interplay of what is violently present and what is hauntingly absent? What does it mean to live in non-contemporaneous time when the time of Republic never quite maps onto the time of post-genocide? So second is a set of epistemological questions, and here I want to contextualize the talk within Lerna's larger scholarship. There is a fundamental paradox when it comes to producing knowledge on the Armenian genocide of 1915 and its afterlives. On the one hand, there is recognition of the genocide on a global scale. On the other hand, Turkey's official denial of genocide has been sustained through a well-coordinated apparatus involving education, media, the law, everyday tactics of racialization and intimidation, and it has also cleverly adapted to the demands of the time, so moving from categorical denial to evasion, to distortion, to trivialization, or to what Mamigonian has called the manufacturing of doubt. Given this climate of denial, some scholars prioritize the work of documentation, piling up evidence after evidence. Others, for example, philosopher Mark-Nishanian, insist on the limits or even the futility of producing knowledge on the genocide and its afterlives through the empirical methods of social science. So to me, Lerna is particularly adept at threading that difficult needle. She has dedicated herself to meticulous archival research while being acutely aware of the inherent biases and shortcomings of the archives themselves, mindful of what Derrida more fancifully has called archive fever. In a 2021 essay of Dark Pasts and Pipe Dreams, the Turkish University, probably a favorite of mine, Lerna has articulated the relevance of a comparative framework between the epistemic violence of trivializing the continuing violence of slavery in the American present and the systematic denial of the Armenian genocide in Turkey and its continued distortions and erasures in the predominant scholarship in Turkish studies. But she persists in excavation work nevertheless. Her first book, co-authored with Melissa Bilal, the one that Roberta referred to, Bir Adalet Fermanı, put on the map 5 pioneering Armenian feminists of the late Ottoman Empire who had been left out of the canon. But, and this is crucial, what Ekmekçioğlu and Bilal did was not just additive work. It was constitutive work. That is to say, their approach fundamentally redefined how we understand the feminist movement in Turkey, illustrating how the ambition of Armenian feminists has shaped and constrained the development, practice, and the teaching of feminism. In a piece about to be published, or maybe it's out already, Ekmekçioğlu has literally dug out of oblivion Vartuhi Kadantar Nalbantian, a young woman who was arrested by the authorities in Istanbul in the spring of 1915 and served for 2.5 years in Istanbul's central prison, where she wrote what is known to be the first prison memoir by a woman in the Middle East. And the upcoming anthology, which Dr. Ekmekçioğlu is editing with Melisa Bilal, Feminism in Armenian, was poised to become the quintessential anthology on the history of Western Armenian feminism, inscribing previously unrecognized feminist figures into the historiographies of Armenia, Turkey, and the Ottoman Empire. So another way in which I see this lecture as a continuation of some of Lerna's key concerns in her academic trajectory is her insistence on confronting oxymoronic subject positions. Her second book, Recovering Armenia, published by Stanford, tackled how someone could be an Armenian and a feminist in the post-genocidal landscape of Turkey when maintaining one's identity as Armenian and as a genocide survivor relied so heavily on traditionally gendered roles and expectations. Okay, to conclude, let me end with a couple of provocations along this line of inquiry of oxymoronic subject positions that undergird the existence of Armenians in post-genocide Turkey today. So I was really moved, Lerna, by the subtly central role your father plays in this lecture, and I hadn't known that. And it made me think of another near impossible subject position, that of the leftist Armenian in Turkey. And I'm thinking in particular of two figures I've been fascinated with. I'm thinking about Aram Pehlivanyan and Barton Ihmalyan, two members of the Communist Party who, despite their forced conscription as part of the 20 classes of public work military service of 1941, which was a policy, by the way, exclusively applied to Armenians, Greek, and Jews, and whose families suffered the tax wealth imposed on, again, only non-Muslim minorities, emphasize only their identity as comrades throughout their very active membership in the Turkish Communist Party, and completely downplay their Armenianness, both in that work and in their literary publications. And obviously, these identity displacements cannot be understood independently of the denialist foundations of the Turkish Communist Party itself that has never reckoned with the genocide, and that denial has persisted within Turkey's left-wing circles as well. The other and final concern, and this is like a question I'm in the midst of formulating, so it'll be probably not as coherent, but I'm wondering how you would put side by side, how you would square or hold in tension, how you ended the paper. This idea of the counterfactuals, and then given all these possibilities, this was probably the best out of all possible deals, right? So that, and then with what, again, a colleague and friend of ours, Ohannes Kılıçdaroğlu, has written in a forthcoming essay, about the very simple but brute reality of the Armenians in Turkey today being their consistently dwindling numbers. So again, when you talked about your father and family, you mentioned the migrations as Gastarbeiter to Europe, which also I think is a fascinating topic because this is something not adequately researched and gets kind of normalized as migration, but it's actually part and parcel of the limited possibilities for survival for Armenians in a post-genocidal landscape and has contributed to that dwindling of numbers. But I guess I'm just wondering how to think about that reality, that with each passing year, there is kind of a diminishment of the actual population almost to the point of an absent presence, and how might this brute fact of numbers speak to your counterfactuals? Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you for your insightful commentary. I see many parallels with what we are planning to discuss in the next half an hour with two more guests this evening. So let me then turn to the second panelist. It is my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Prodromou, my dear colleague, visiting professor in the International Studies program at Boston College, and an affiliated faculty member of the Islamic Civilization and Societies program and the Boyce Center for Religion and American Public Life. Her research covers the intersections of geopolitics, religion, and human rights, with focus on East Mediterranean and Middle East. Her current research focuses on two areas: religious geopolitics and typologies of power, with a case study of Russian influence building through religious soft and sharp power, something that I'm personally very much interested in, and the effects of cultural heritage policy on institutional religious freedom and religious pluralism. She served a diplomatic appointment on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and she was a member of the U.S. Secretary of State Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group. She's co-editor of two volumes, Eastern Orthodox Christianity and American Higher Education, and is widely published in academic journals. So, Elizabeth, the floor is yours, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Vesko.
Would you like, oh, you're all mic'd up.
I'm mic'd up, yeah. And I would ask you to give me 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay, I will do that, no worries.
That'll be great, okay, all right. Let me make sure I get this so it doesn't fall, okay. Okay, great. Well, I feel a bit intimidated coming after two just tour de force presentations, but it was my pleasure to listen to both of you. And I appreciate the possibility to be here. I want to thank the organizers for today's event, and Elizabeth, Aimee, and thank you for your incredible professionalism in every inquiry that we all made to you. And especially thank you to you, Vesko, for convening us. When we, just by way of a little bit of background, when we began brainstorming the moving parts of today's presentation, under the broad rubric of the Ottoman Legacy, we were focusing on a couple of different things. First of all, we began our conversation about religion and politics in Southeastern Europe in terms of the importance of religious literacy for diplomats and practitioners of international relations. Now, religious literacy is a somewhat new concept in theoretical and operational terms in IR, but religious literacy generally entails the ability to discern and analyze the fundamental intersections of religion and social, cultural, and political life through multiple lenses. Religious literacy also implies a basic understanding of the history, the central texts, if texts are relevant, beliefs, practices, and contemporary manifestations of a religious tradition, and also understanding the historical origins of the present expressions of religion. So we were talking about the importance of religious literacy for diplomats. We were also focused, as Vesko mentioned, I'm going by first names, I hope this is okay. As Vesko mentioned, we were focused on the specific question of Russian influence building in Southeast Europe through religion. So my remarks are developed against this background and within the context of the current conjuncture of the centennial of the establishment of the Republic of Turkey on the one hand, and the ongoing Russian war in Ukraine. And I want to offer brief input into how states are using religion for geopolitics in the current international order. I'll give you just a couple of bullet points because of time constraints on how both Russia and Turkey are instrumentalizing religion for influence building in Southeastern Europe, and then I'll close with a few thoughts on what is to be done. So in terms of background, in the 3+ decades that have elapsed since the end of the Cold War, it's almost become hackneyed by now, but a commonplace to talk about the return of religion in international relations. The return of religion, the religious turn in IR, the desecularization of the world, the sacralization of politics, the rise of religious nationalism, etc. All of these phrases capture the surprise of academics and policymakers at the sustainability of religion in the world. And social scientists in particular have produced a plethora of research that has aimed to explain the analytic, predictive, and methodological deficiencies of secularization theory. And I think parenthetically, it's worth noting that secularization theory itself, until really the last 30, 35 years or so, had taken on its own aura of sacred truth. I would say secularization theory had been sacralized because it became the paradigm for understanding religion and world affairs, empirical evidence to the contrary. Now, despite this remarkably rich research that's redefined the study of religion in IR, there's a lot of diversity and still contestation. But there are some continuities, thematic and operational, that I think are worth pointing out. The first is the tendency to view religion as the trespasser into politics. So states are viewed as respecting some sort of invisible line that divides politics and religion, the secular from the sacred. And notice here that the categories and the discourses remain largely unchanged, even with this revisionist critical turn. Now, in this approach, religion, and by this I mean religious ideas, religious leaders, institutions, organizations, movements, practices, religion is the category disruptor for geopolitics. It's God who is trespassing into politics and geopolitics. The second thematic continuity in the post-Cold War period is the tendency to focus on religious freedom, or freedom of conscience, belief, and religion. FORB, the acronym to explain why religion has become out of place, why it's trespassing into legal, political, and social spaces where it doesn't belong. Now, these two tendencies we can see in what has become an evolution in the intersection between religion and diplomacy, and in how it is that states have begun to try to take religion seriously as a geopolitical force in Southeastern Europe and worldwide. And I want to give you some examples because this might be a different sort of space, but it bumps up against some of what we heard from the previous two speakers. First of all, states, and this is something that the United States really began and other states have replicated. Here, I'm referring to the example in 1998 when the US Congress probably undertook its last unanimous act, and I think that's empirically true. They passed the International Religious Freedom Act, which created an Office of International Religious Freedom in the State Department, an independent US government agency, the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, on which I served for 8 years, and it also created a special advisor to the President on international religious freedom in the National Security Council. Interestingly enough, that position was never filled until 2020, and then only for a brief period of time. Now, other countries and international organizations have followed suit in trying to grasp the intersection between religion and diplomacy. For example, the European Commission has a special advisor on freedom of religion or belief. The OSCE has incorporated freedom of religion or belief as a human right crucial to its comprehensive framework for peace and security. The OSCE has appointed a special rapporteur dealing with anti-Semitism, another dealing with Islamophobia, and it's established within the Office for Democratic Institutions on Human Rights a freedom of religion or belief program. The UN has created a special rapporteur on religious intolerance as part of the UN Human Rights Council, and the UN has also created a special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief in the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. The US expanded its focus from international religious freedom more broadly to religious engagement by creating in the State Department an Office of Religion and Global Affairs, and other EU member states have done the same. They've created offices of human rights, freedoms and inclusion. They have, in France, they have created a special envoy for protection of freedom of religion or belief and interreligious dialogue. Italy, for example. They've created task force with minister plenipotentiary for intercultural and interreligious dialogue. Austria, just to name a few. So this brief review underscores a couple of important facts. One, states and international organizations alike take religion seriously as a variable in global change. And two, states have moved gradually beyond the narrow focus on freedom of religion or belief, and instead recognize that religion is connected to the full range of human rights and security considerations that are embedded in instruments in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if we were to go through the primary international human rights instruments, we would see that religion has now made its way into those human rights instruments. For example, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and I can go on and on. Now, is this good news? Well, perhaps. We see a turn towards a more sophisticated understanding of the centrality of religion to peace and order in our time. And we also see a more sophisticated understanding of the types of human rights that are related to freedom of religion or belief, and that includes no belief and the right to change one's belief, and also these rights embedded both in communities and in individuals. But at the same time as we have seen these things happen, how am I on time? 5 minutes, okay, great. States have also begun to move beyond the notion of the secular religious divide, and instead they are demonstrating, I would argue, a very concerning tendency to instrumentalize or weaponize religion for geopolitical purposes. And here is where the Russia and Turkey cases come up in Southeastern Europe. Specifically, states have begun to bring God into politics. And by that, I mean they are using 4 tools that are meant to instrumentalize religion for power purposes. 1, through hard power, coercion, through using religious actors and resources for military, economic, and political reasons. 2, through soft power, persuasion, again, using religious assets, ideas, teachings, practices, identities for persuasion. 3, through penetration, that is sharp power, using mis- and disinformation, communication, and a host of digital technologies to disseminate ideas and messages about religion and about faith groups. And then 4th, in combination, through smart power. Now, as states have turned to instrumentalize religion for complex power purposes, this also means a recognition of the liminality of religion, the porousness of borders and boundaries, and how religious ideas and actors can operate above and below borders and boundaries. And this brings me to the 2 examples of Turkey and Russia in Southeastern Europe. And I'll be insanely synoptic here because we barely have any time. Interestingly enough, we're talking about 2 states that have autocratic, authoritarian regimes with, I would submit, increasingly totalitarian features. Party state, charismatic leader associated with the party state, state control over all civil society, no dissent. Both regimes are also committed to territorial revisionism through using concepts of near abroad that rely on their imperial histories, Russian and Ottoman. And both states are actively using religion as a mobilizational tool for influence building in Southeastern Europe. In the case of Russia, it's the Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church. In the case of Turkey, it's the Diyanet, the Directorate of Religious Affairs. There's a whole host of research on the Russia case. I would be happy in the Q&A to talk about my work in the Kremlin playbook. But here, in the case of Russia, what I would say is that the Kremlin-Moscow Patriarchate Partnership has focused on the geospace of Greece, including the Church of Greece and Mount Athos, because this is a force multiplier space when it comes to other Balkan countries. It also is a disruptive space when it comes to Greece's role inside NATO. And again, I'm happy to go into detail about how this happens. In the case of Turkey, again, a growing body of research on the Diyanet in terms of Ankar's influence building in Southeastern Europe, where in the case of Russia, the focus has been on Mount Athos, the Holy Mountain as it's called, which is a space that includes all of global orthodoxy, messaging, investment, financial investment, the use of digital media platforms for promoting certain kinds of cultural wars messages. In the case of Turkey, what we see with the Diyanet are similar actions. With an estimated $2 billion annual budget, the Diyanet is the foundational piece of religious diplomacy that's designed to influence the former Ottoman territories in Southeastern Europe to build a belief-based transnational solidarity and affiliation with Turkey. And again, I'm happy to go into more detail in terms of the different types of power in both cases. So what's to be done? One, we need to get over our secularist bias when we think about the relationship between religion and international relations. Religion is here to stay, so what does that mean and what's to be done? Two, develop religious literacy for diplomats. As we have economic literacy and cultural literacy and political literacy, religious literacy is important. Three, do not instrumentalize international religious freedom or freedom of religion or belief. And then four, with regard to the two case studies, I would say be sensitive to the way in which Russia and Turkey are weaponizing religion for influence building in ways that are incompatible with a sovereignty-based world, and with a phrase for which I think it's hard for all of us to take very seriously, given what we see in the world around us, but a rules-based international order. Thank you.
You saved a minute, so that thoughtful, provocative, and I'm sure that there will be questions about your intervention. And there's one who comes from the Balkans. I'm very well aware of this interplay of religion and politics, and how both countries that you mentioned, Turkey and Russia, instrumentalize, weaponize religion for political purposes. And they have a number of proxies, allies in the region to support that. So, with the further ado, I will turn to our third panelist this evening, Professor Aimee Genell, colleague from my old school, Pardee School of Global Studies. Aimee's research focuses on the history of the late Ottoman Empire and its relations with Europe in the area of international law and international relations. Her book, Empire by Law, The Ottoman Origins of the Mandate System in the Middle East, traces the Ottoman roots of the post-imperial political order through an analysis of the inter-imperial contest over autonomous Egypt in the late 19th and early 20th century. Recently, she has started a new research. The project is on the history of the Allied military occupation of Ottoman lands after the First World War, 1918-1923, which somehow overlaps with what the first lecture was. Aimee, the floor is yours. I'm looking forward to your intervention. You know the rules, so.
You can yell at me if I go over. Oh, wait, I need my microphone.
Do you want this one?
Yeah, I guess
Okay.
I don't know if I need one. I'm really loud. Okay,
Me too, but I need it, you know.
All right, okay. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Roberta and also to Vesko for inviting me to participate in this event, and of course to Elizabeth for making everything function behind the scenes. So I was asked to reflect upon Ottoman legacies in the Balkans, and I should note that this doesn't work. I thought I was really loud. Oh, there we go. Okay. It's hard to hear yourself like that. All right. So I was asked to reflect upon the Ottoman legacies in the Balkans, and I want to note that I'm a legal historian of the late Ottoman Empire, and I've certainly researched and written about the reworking of imperial institutions in Turkey as well as the Arab provinces, and I welcome the opportunity to think about imperial afterlives in another post-Ottoman space. So in preparing my comments, I was struck by both similar imperial continuities across the Middle East, Anatolia, and the Balkans, but also, of course, striking divergences within each region, some of which I think was based on the moment of imperial separation. So despite dramatic variations across post-Ottoman lands, it's clear that in the 19th and early 20th century, the empire functioned as a laboratory for political, legal, and administrative experiments to manage multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and a multilingual polity. In both the age of increased state centralization at home in the empire, and also greater European legal intervention in Ottoman affairs. So such political and legal experiments mattered after empire, which were not only durable in post-Ottoman spaces, but I would think more broadly had implications for ends of other empires as well. So I'm going to focus my analysis on two overlapping themes that I see in the Ottoman legacy of the Balkans. I was drawn back to the 19th century because, you know, the Balkans got out earlier. Okay. So I'm going to focus on the emergence of religious minorities as a legal category framed by both domestic and international law, and the ways in which Ottoman imperial administrative institutions were reconfigured and persisted after empire. So as many of us know, Greece was the first post-Ottoman Balkan state recognized by Europe in 1832, and was very much seen as an experiment to neutralize an unstable periphery to Europe. An equally important administrative experiment, however, emerged out of the years of imperial crisis in the 1820s when European states intervened militarily in the Balkans. Through a brutal civil war between the empire and its Greek subjects, European powers pressed the Ottomans to reorganize Christian-majority provinces in the Balkans as autonomous principalities under the sovereignty of the Sultan. By the early 1830s, after years of warfare, European and Ottoman empires hashed out the final agreements on the status of Greece, but also the province of Serbia, the Danubian principalities, today parts of Romania, as well as the island of Samos. So while Greece gained independence, the other provinces were awarded local administrative autonomy and an organic charter, a règlement organique, that laid out how each province would be administered. This new status for Balkan provinces was guaranteed in international law by treaty and also the domestic law of the empire. So they remained in the imperial fold, but with vast local powers. And such sites became, I would argue, testing grounds for new forms of imperial administration, new forms of law, and also authority. And this was an experiment in which the centralizing state engaged as much as locals in the Balkans, as well as Europeans who intervened very much. So until 1878, statehood on the model of Greece was very much the exception, whereas this autonomy compromise was the norm and remained so through the end of the Ottoman Empire. European powers compelled the Ottoman state to extend autonomy to several provinces over the course of the 19th century, up through 1914. One of the last compromises was the Armenian Compromise, of course, of February 1914, which would have reorganized the 6 eastern provinces as 2 autonomous provinces. All of these, this autonomy compromise were rooted in experimental models worked out in the Balkans in the 1820s and 30s. So in other words, while Greece offered one possibility for reconfiguring imperial sovereignty, independence, those in Romania and Serbia would prove far more durable options in the late empire. So the Balkans provided another arena for legal experimentation in the 1870s. In the aftermath of another round of war with Russia, which was prefaced by European demands to extend administrative autonomy to Bulgaria, as well as Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro gained independence. Unlike in Greece in the 1830s, European diplomats were far more concerned about the status of religious minorities, both Muslim and Jewish, in the new Christian majority states. So European diplomatic recognition hinged upon the new states creating legal protections for civil and religious rights for non-Christians. So much like the autonomy agreements of the 1830s, these new laws were enshrined not just in international treaty, but also in domestic legislation. Thus, Berlin represented the emergence of Muslim minorities within new legal orders in the Balkans. So while Berlin set the terms for how non-Christians would be managed in the new Balkan states, it was up to civil authorities and local Muslim actors who had very divergent ideas about Islamic practice and political claims to fight out what Berlin's minority guarantees meant and how they would be codified and incorporated into the state. As Emily Grebel and Leila Amzi's research shows, the new Christian majority states borrowed and reworked existing largely Ottoman but also Habsburg legal and administrative practices to manage confessional minorities. But the big takeaway, and the one that helps crystallize the experience of so many everyday subjects in the late Ottoman Empire and across the Balkans, was that Muslim emerged as a legal category, in much the same way that non-Muslim would also emerge as a legal category, and determined belonging in a late Ottoman world, but also a post-Ottoman world as well. So in the new Balkan states, Muslims maintained control over Islamic courts, pious foundations, religious schools, and Islamic law. And it was through these Islamic institutions that Balkan Muslims experienced the state while at the same time centralizing the states, such as in Serbia, attempted to assert more control over its Muslim citizens, much like the Ottoman Empire before it had. But this is not the imperial story of British, French, and Muslim management of Islam, where Muslims were given limited autonomy over religious institutions in lieu of civil and political rights, as was the case, for instance, for Muslims in interwar Mandate Palestine. Instead, Balkan Muslims obtained authority over Islamic institutions precisely because they were framed as citizens. I mean, it's really, your talk made me really think about this. What kind of citizens? I mean, also step citizens. A legal status that was mandated through international law by the Berlin Treaty, and again codified in domestic law and new constitutions in Balkan states. So from an Ottoman perspective, the legal status of individual subjects shaped everyday life and determined everything from the amount of, and kind of taxes one paid to the state, to conscription, imperial privileges, and choice of legal venue to press legal claims. Thus, we should not be surprised that Muslims in post-Ottoman Balkans, as much as civil authorities in Serbia or Montenegro, understood Muslim as a legally constructed category. It was closely aligned with Ottoman practices in the 19th century. Law mattered in Ottoman and post-Ottoman states in distinct ways from practices elsewhere in Europe. That's also what I'm trying to get at. Okay. Oh my God, all right. All right, so while law and its codification within state institutions was crucial in both the Ottoman and Balkan cases for framing claims to citizenship and belonging, religious law was also understood as the arena in which it was possible to assert forms of autonomy against new states' drives for centralization. Indeed, Balkan Muslims attempted to gain autonomy in strikingly similar ways to the tactics employed by Ottoman subjects, often non-Muslim Ottoman subjects, but also Muslim subjects. Across the confessional spectrum, who tried to wrest local control from centralizing empires bent on standardizing law, administration, and regimes of citizenship. So debates about the nature of rights allocated to minorities were as deeply politicized in Belgrade as they were in Istanbul. There were persistent disputes about whether Muslims had rights or privileges. Serbia's military service exemption for madrasa students during the Balkan Wars, a well-established practice in Ottoman lands until the First World War, crystallized this debate as a clash between rights versus special privileges that were not afforded to Christian citizens. Similar arguments played out across the Ottoman border in parliament and in the Turkish, Greek, Armenian, Arabic, and Ladino presses between 1908 through the early 1920s, and I would argue never more so than during the armistice era at the end of the First World War between 1918 and 1923. So I'm going to kind of switch gears by looking at, and I know you thought I was going to talk about the 80s or something, but it turned out to be the 1880s. I'm going to switch gears and talk about a little bit about the armistice era. So in November of 1918, the First World War had formally ended, but unlike the German and Habsburg monarchies, the Ottoman Empire didn't cease to exist at the moment of the armistice. Instead, warfare continued through the fall of 1922, during which time the future of the state was literally up for grabs. Despite the fact that the capital, vast stretches of the empire were under Allied military occupation, scores of Ottoman bureaucrats, lawyers, and intellectuals did not, incredibly, anticipate the complete obliteration of the empire. In Istanbul, like other imperial capitals across the vanquished empire, debates raged on the future administration of the state, and in particular, how citizenship would be structured in the aftermath of years of continuous warfare, famine, military occupation, the complete destruction of the pre-war social order, and of course, genocide. When the armistice was signed on August 30th, 1918, the legal position of non-Muslims within the post-war political order was not at all clear and bitterly contested. Ottoman newspaper editors hashed out how two types of legal privilege had functioned in the pre-war empire. First, they analyzed the practice of decentralized administration in the exceptional or privileged provinces, places like Serbia and Romania, later Mount Lebanon, Crete, and Egypt. And second, and very much related, they wrestled with the function of non-Muslim privileges within the future state. These analyses were intertwined with an understanding of how imperial institutions and legal structures, particularly those imposed by Europe in the 19th century, had operated from the 1860s through the start of the First World War. To provide just one example, and then I promise I will quit talking. just to provide one example of how fraught these debates were, one need only look at Ali Kamal, the liberal politician, the Muslim liberal politician and writer, who, not uniquely actually, explicitly condemned, as he termed it, quote, the planned annihilation, imha, of Ottoman Armenians by the wartime government. For Ali Kamal, the multi-ethnic, multi-religious aspect of the empire absolutely had to be preserved in 1918. But he argued a new legal footing. So despite the fact that Ottoman Armenians had been targeted for elimination on the basis of their religious and ethnic identity, he insisted that in this new imperial order, non-Muslims should renounce all special protections and rights that differentiated their legal status from Muslim citizens. True citizenship, Hakiki Vatandash, he wrote, could only be achieved if all Ottomans had the same rights and social and economic benefits. So he insisted that legal privileges for Muslims open the door to Europe and diminish state sovereignty. Okay. So at Lausanne, as we heard earlier, the emergent Turkish state's critiques were manifested in protests against the imposition of minority rights guarantees by the League of Nations and allied efforts to create autonomous provinces for Armenians and Kurds in the new state. I mean, and those demands are also made by Armenians and Kurds. Thus, the question of privileged provinces and people remained at the forefront of political disputes through the end of the Independence War and the Treaty of Lausanne, when the diplomats gathered in Switzerland opted to exchange Christian and Muslim populations between Greece and the emergent Turkey instead of implementing a more robust system of minority rights protection. And the last attempts to create autonomous areas within Turkey were also fully crushed. So Ottoman legacies continued to shape post-Ottoman polities long after the empire was dead. There were striking divergences and parallels between interwar Yugoslavia and Turkey. Yugoslavia's first constitution guaranteed that Muslim family and inheritance cases would be adjudicated in state Islamic courts, similar to what we heard about the minority rights clauses of the Lausanne Treaty. Mustafa Kemal ditched Islamic courts and the codified Islamic law that had been used in that system with the first Turkish legal code. But at the same time, both centralizing states targeted Islam as an object in need of reform, and also religious institutions fell under greater and greater state control. For Ottoman Muslims, in contrast, who found themselves under British and French colonial control and the League mandates, Muslims were guaranteed religious recognition of rights without corresponding civic and political rights, as was the case in Mandate Palestine.
I will then call all of you to sit here. I know that these high chairs are not comfortable, but if I survive for half an hour, I think you're going to survive. Yeah? So then we will open now the Q&A, and I will turn to you, but allow me to make a couple of points before turning to the audience, and not just points about how to pose questions. I see many things in common between these four lectures, and for example, as I can see that I see some parallels in how Muslim minorities are treated in, let's say, dominantly Orthodox Christian countries in the Balkans compared with how non-Muslim minority is treated in Turkey. I also see parallel in how Lausanne, Treaty of Lausanne actually abolished Turkey to some extent, with how Dayton Agreement abolished Serbs and their ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we can then go over it and seeing the parallels, historical parallels, parallels in different historical moments, that politics sometimes driven by interests of the moment, or the interest to stop the war is ready to turn eye blind to something which has happened before. So when it comes to churches, I would say that church, almost every survey in all parts of the world will confirm that church is most trusted institution, whether I speak now about Orthodox churches or Muslim religious communities. And my concluding point is that also speaks about the lack of trust in state institutions. So in a corrupted state, church is always or often seen as a guardian of morality, and therefore it possesses power, which is then used by politics for political purposes. Okay, now I will turn to you to pose questions. Please introduce yourself. Please limit yourself on questions rather than comments. And I will pick 2 questions and then turn to our panelists. So who will be the first? Let me see. I see three hands now. Okay. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Alex Kanopoulos. So today, ethnic cleansing is generally considered a war crime. So Professor Ekmekçioğlu provocatively asked whether the negotiated exchange of populations 100 years ago, maybe in retrospect, was a good thing. And in spite of being a deportation victim myself, I tend to agree with her. So the question for the panel is whether we should consider protection of multi-ethnicity and combating ethnic cleansing as a universal, almost moral commandment, or should we go in the direction of more of a, if you will, realpolitik approach, case by case? And this is obviously very applicable today. You know, 1 or 2 state solution in the Middle East, maybe Kosovo, maybe Nagorno-Karabakh, others that I cannot think of. It's important to think of that. So that's the question.
Oh, thank you. Who is the next? Who? You.
My name is Gonja Somes-Poor in the Lerna. So some of those questions you were pondering at the end of your talk were fascinating to me, like what would have happened, like if it was this way and if it was that way. And when you mentioned the, you know, maybe if they had stuck with the Serb agreement, and what if like Armenians actually had some kind of autonomy in those lands where, and then what if, were they going to be like Native American reservations? One thing came to my mind where like what was the situation of resources for the Armenians at that time? What was going to happen to them? Because obviously right now in the United States, reservations are one of the poorest areas in the state. So I'm just wondering, like, what was the status of Armenians that actually had survived and could have been put in those areas?
About ethnic cleansing question, I think in principle and without any doubt, we should condemn ethnic cleansing and should not valorize or support it, period, right? However, as you suggested, I think that's where your question is going, there are some cases, I mean, I don't want to even say like case by case basis because it means the failure of the whole international order. The broader question is like we should, as the species who can come up with institutions and hopefully also manage their enforcement, such as the League of Nations, United Nations, NATO, we should be able to prevent ethnic cleansing from or genocide from happening in the first place. But if we fail to do that, the post factum condemnation of a de facto solution to a problem, actually. The Greek-Turkish exchange population was something, I'm specifically focusing on this because that was my example. That's what it had already happened. So like hundreds of thousands of Greeks were already defeated in Western Anatolia and were pushed to decay, and they were like literally made into refugees already, right? Like it kind of sealed the whole process with a legal name called the exchange of populations, which maybe, like with a huge cost to actually Muslims who were in Greece at the time, who were having their, like more or less I guess, normal life, but I think Aimee will know more about them, like the status of Muslims in Greece proper at the time. In this case, I am hesitant to condemn it as such, because their lives within Turkey, even when we don't do the retrospective anachronistic thing that I might be sounding of, even at that time, the realpolitik solution was possibly better. It's the most unpopular idea right now in the literature, but I would be also extremely interested to hear what others are thinking about this. Regarding the other question of what kind of sources Armenians had to even maintain an autonomy if they had secured one at Lausanne, not much. They needed some kind of like Western backing. They were hoping, and the United States actually was kind of ready to at least send, as it always does, money, right? The Congress approved like $10 million to be sent to that possible Armenian National Home. It was called Armenian National Home, but they knew that it was not going to happen anyway. I mean, it is kind of it's a stillborn project. But I would also be very interested in hearing Aimee's, not factual basis, but in comparison, for instance, other cases of secured autonomy, maybe in the Balkans and maybe in the Arab world, Arab Ottoman world, where we have kind of a survivor group managing to have autonomy and keeping it for a while. You know, like I don't know an analogy, a case that we can make some comparisons from. Maybe there isn't one that I would be interested in.
Anybody else? Yeah, Alison?
She has a mic.
Oh, yeah. Give me too many microphones.
Yeah, I echo Lerna's position that we should reject ethnic cleansing as a solution. It's not a solution. I mean, even if we're talking about, put the moral piece of it aside, even if we talk about the, what's oftentimes held up as a paradigmatic case, the Greek-Turkish population exchange, it wasn't a full exchange. And the fact of the matter is that even in 1923, there are, depending on who counts, anywhere between 125,000 to 200,000 Greek Orthodox still left in Istanbul alone. Okay, so those populations which are left behind, when we accept the logic of exchange, become hostage populations. If we're going to accept ethnic cleansing as some sort of and I'll say why I think it's also fictitious reordering of the international system, it means we're also giving up on the concept of democracy. And I'm, however in bad shape democracy is in our world today, including here in the United States, I'm not ready yet to give up on it. But those populations that are left behind, they always are remnant populations. They become hostage populations that are treated as fifth columns by non-democratic states. And the other thing too is that in a world of people on the move, constantly on the move, I mean, it's impossible to imagine that there would be ethnically or religiously homogeneous states around the world. People move, people marry, people give birth, unless we're going to overturn all citizenship criteria. The idea of these kind of homogenized states, I think is, not only do I have moral objections to it, but I think it's practically impossible. And then finally, on the federation-confederation approach, I think there I am much more ambivalent because, the model, the Lipset model of consociationalism, I mean, even Lipset himself has publicly eventually came out and said, it works in like 3 cases. But if we see, and this is where citizenship and I think equality before the state becomes so important, because when we see consociational arrangements that are based on identity groups, and here I look at cases like Cyprus or Bosnia-Herzegovina, or, well, those are the 2 best examples, I think. We see that they don't necessarily work. Lebanon, what they do is they institutionalize and they legalize the very identity categories that oftentimes were generating violence to begin with. So although I think autonomy rights are very useful, I think those have to be negotiated very much on a case-by-case basis in order to avoid, blowback and unintended consequences.
My question was intended to be provocative, of course. I was not
Yeah, no, I
advocating
no,
for
I
ethnic
appreciate
cleansing.
Just add something to Elizabeth's point, which I totally get, but for instance, in the Turkish case, I mean, in principle, I agree with you, right? Theoretically, of course, yes, but Turkey itself was trying to homogenize. It's a post-genocide country. It did everything to homogenize and standardize and flatten difference, right? So the leftover population was going to suffer from it. That's why the exchange idea, I'm struggling with it. I don't yet have the language, but because it is this coexistence is seen such a big danger by the Armenians. When you look, they are scared of Turks, right? So they want to be away from them, but at the same time, they don't want to leave their houses either, right? That is that tension that I think possibly an exchange, at least in the next generation, could have solved. Okay, so I just.
But that also, Turkey is a particular case. I mean, it's a case of unacknowledged genocide against the Christian populations, and so the state itself has become hostage to that denial. The state has to invest enormous amounts of human resources, financial resources, educational resources, and diplomatic resources in sustaining denial, which has consequences then for the population that might have, and this is where your counterfactual questions come in, might have moved in a different direction than what the reality is today. Or as you mentioned, Ayşe, you mentioned, the things which are spoken but which are not spoken. So what creates the possibilities for the spoken in quiet spaces to be addressed in public spaces?
If I may, do you want to make a comment?
Oh, no, I was just going to say very briefly that just thinking about population transfer, I think it's worthwhile to think about when that idea was revived, because many people at the time thought that it was a disaster in 1923, and it was revived during the Second World War, when people are rethinking population, and there's of course an underlying theory, unstated theory of violence, which is that that different people can't live together without legal structures. So.
But from my perspective, I just want to tell you that this idea is still popular in the Balkans. Serbian idea to exchange territories with Kosovo is nothing but that one, to homogenize its territory, and also what you mentioned that it's a for country, like since I lived to that time and I witnessed ethnic cleansing and the war and the end of my country. So for Serbia today, as it was for Turkey at the time, was difficult to acknowledge genocide happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina and its role in that. So therefore, it has become hostage of its past. And as long as it, decides to address that past with open eyes, I think this is gonna continue like this. So we can see these historical, patterns repeating in the 21st century or in the late 20th century. Regrettably, ethnic cleansing was introduced into international relations and recognized as an act of war crime because of Yugoslavia in 90s. So therefore, in a sad way, we contributed to this. Please, I have two more questions. Gentlemen in the last row.
Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Clenard. I am a student here at Boston University. I'm a final year studying international relations. Thank you so much for this lecture. It's been wonderful hearing it all from your perspectives. Dr. Ekmekçioğlu, in regards to your lecture in particular, I apologize if you may have touched on this, but for some of the Armenians who actually did end up leaving Turkey and joining the Armenian state, what was the sense of belonging that they actually found there? Because in other instances, such as the Greeks who fled after the pogroms in Turkey, many of them faced severe discrimination as well from the Greeks in Athens and other places where they arrived, because they weren't seen as fully Greek, they were seen more so as Turkish, so they never really found that exact sense of identity anywhere.
And one more question here.
As we're mixing the personal and the scholarly, as a member of the Greek community who did not leave, and we didn't leave till 1980 and stubbornly stayed in Istanbul. I mean, Istanbul was home, and Athens was a little village until 1954 or something. And the thought of leaving the Queen of Cities was just, my grandparents absolutely fought it. But my point is more about, so I work with literature, and I read this fantastic book, which I'm sure at least some of you have read, My Grandmother, Fethiye Çetin, where Fethiye Çetin discovers that her grandmother is a remainder of the Armenians who've been massacred. And her grandmother on her deathbed says to her when she's being asked, why didn't you leave, why didn't you do something, why didn't you assert your identity more? And she said, I wanted those days to be gone and to never come back again. And watching what's happening in the Middle East now, of course, where I'm rethinking, what is it, what can we do? I mean, we keep coming back to ethnic cleansing, we keep coming back to killing each other, and how do we avoid this? And I was thinking of different scenarios that are presented in works of art. And I'm thinking about Bir Tutam Baharat or Politiki Kutsina in Greek, A Touch of Spice in English, where you have the Turk and the Greek sitting in a hammam. They have to take all their clothes off, and they're in the steamy room. It's not sexual. It's the only way they're able to talk to each other when they remove all of these outward identities. I mean, because one of the gentlemen, if you've seen the movie, is in the Turkish military. He has to take off his outfit, and the Greek has to take off his outfit. So one can say, oh, you left, and the other can say, we didn't leave, we were forced out. And they can have the conversation about this troubled history. I mean, there are several, and then there's a propaganda movie about the Turkish-Syrian border, where, again, one of the guys who remains on the wrong side of the border, I mean, he's going to drive his truck through the security checkpoint, the passport control violently, but his truck has a Turkish flag on it because he became Syrian after the border was forcibly drawn. And they both end up having to take off their clothes, and they're in their underwear having this very serious conversation because it's the only way they can do it. If they're wearing their national, ethnic, religious identities, they cannot do it. So how are we going to get out of this? How are we going to take off all our clothes and manage to see each other as human beings? That's my question.
Do we have an answer? Do we have an answer? I'm not sure. Do we have an answer to that question? Who dares? Who dares? Let me see who dares. Maybe you have an answer, okay?
Hammam solution.
Hammam solution.
Is this on?
Yeah, I think yes.
Can you hear me?
I don't think it's on. I don't know what's going on with it.
Is anyone in this room ready to see Donald Trump and Joe Biden naked? Because they're implicated in all of this as well. Okay. There's a trauma in the trauma.
Yeah, I don't think this works, but hopefully you can hear me. I'm Lucic Kushev, here, a professor at Boston University in computer science, completely different area. I know Ayşe from the provost office, not from this.
So lovely to see you here.
Yes, it's beautiful. So I'd like to say that about ethnic cleansings. It's not only moving population, but also whenever you move population, it affects somebody else. It's a domino effect. When the Greeks were forced from Greece, they came to Balkans. They moved Bulgarian population that was there in Macedonia specifically. Then a little bit after late, the Christians did the same thing what the Turks did, with the Christian population. So there is a saying in Balkans: the Christian occupation is worse than Muslim occupation, especially in Macedonia, because occupation by Greeks, occupation by Turks, by Serbs, and so on. Now what is happening to Albania. So we need to learn, as long as we have ethnic states, we are going to have second level citizens, and that is a problem. We have the same in Serbia right now, same in Greece, or in this new North Macedonia, we have Albanians and non-Albanians. So it's very important, regardless of ethnicity, to be a state to be recognized as a naked human being, as somebody pointed out. As long as we don't have that, we're going to have some type of discrimination. We can move populations left and right, back and forth. We'll have what we have in Israel and Palestine today. So that's the only way to change the concept of the state.
If I may add, just from my point of view, not like a question, maybe reduce all identity to religious and ethnic markers. What about if I am a minority being surrounded by my people because I think differently? What about that? How I can feel as a minority, which I often felt when war broke out in my country, not wanting to side by majority, not want to be part of any national group, not wanting to be seen as such, as an individual who can be reduced only to a point to be a member of certain national group, certain religious group, therefore equates with my identity. Can we like walk out from there? I know this is a very difficult question, but just I want to hear your answers.
I'd like to take a shot at that as the resident.
Actually, you have a mic.
Oh, I do. No, I don't anymore. I got rid of it. Can I not use this?
Okay, you can
Am I not allowed
use
to use this mic? Okay, thank you. So, as the resident anthropologist, I think my response to that, or well, it's not maybe just an anthropological perspective, but my response to that really poignant humanistic call, which I completely empathize with, would be nonetheless to say that there is a danger of minimizing existing powers of privilege, right? So it's not the same thing for everyone in a given nation state to cast off their ethnic religious identity, or it's not the same ask, right? So if you're already standing, or if you're already benefiting from certain powers and structures of privilege, it also has its costs, but it comes with more ease to say, I'm going to aspire to be the cosmopolitan here and cast off my ethnic and religious identity. If you're already part of the threatened, marginalized, dispossessed group, I think it can feel very violent to make that same ask of people in the same way who are in that same territory. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that as humanistic a call as that is, I think it is important who is doing the asking and of whom, and is it the same kind of ask for everyone, given that we're not existing in equal positions of power, but are already stratified by different kinds of privilege.
I would like to answer the question about Armenians going to Armenia, Soviet Armenia. There weren't that many who actually went in the 20s or 30s, very few of them. But there was a whole Stalin era, post-war, World War II repatriation effort, Nekat, during which my number, 100,000 people, I think, from the Middle East, the United States, and Europe, Armenian diasporas, many of them survivors of the genocide, repatriated to Soviet Armenia. And we have anecdotal evidence and some memoirs also that they didn't feel at home as such, right? But there wasn't any legal discrimination against them for sure, except, I mean, they were such a part of the place that 10% of them were purged to Siberia, or they were just outright eliminated during the Stalin era. But I see the parallel that you are making here, which is, I've thought about that a lot. Did I go on to someone's question? Oh yes, Roberta's question about anneannem and politica cuzina. I do believe in the power of this production. I mean, I cannot solve your question. I mean, and that imagery that Elizabeth gave us, I never want to return to that Hamas story again. I want to unhear that forever. But I mean, it's very valuable that you bring these examples because, yeah, we will never be able to totally unshed all of our identities and who is asked what at what point matters. But these sources of literature really manage to at least lead us to these questions. I know that like Anneannem Fethiye Çetin's account in Turkey really created a splash. Like it has its own problems, but it did manage to change so many people's minds and opened hearts really to this question. Even if they don't recognize it as genocide, they might even be defensive about it, but there is a human tragedy. And in its most honest description of what had happened, and that the stories are immersed. Like a Turkish person is now an Armenian person, really. It has to be recognized as incredibly important contributions. Maybe more important than scholarly conversations. Politique Cousina, right? Like the touch of spice. I found it to be a little bit romanticized. There's fluff there for sure, but in Turkey, I mean, even in Turkey, I think it was about 15 years ago, I remember so many people reading it. Elif Shafak's Bastard is another example. See, like so many people in this room also read, even if they don't have any. Yeah, so I think literature in itself, I don't want to use the analogy of weapon, but it's a tool that we have in our toolkit to fight against all these divisions.
Anybody else from your side? Or then we have, I realize what is behind our problems with the mics. They have run out of battery. So therefore, please, we have time for one more question.
It's short. Thank you so much, all of you. It's very inspiring and it made me think a great deal. What you said about I'm very pleased how you outlined in a very short form the Treaty of Lausanne. But my big question is, given the history of the Turkish state, and also and how well you identified the Achilles heel, what I would call the Achilles heel of the Turks negotiating the Treaty of Lausanne by saying that rights, by being horribly fearful of rights as privileges. So they signed it, and England helps them sign it along. And then the next, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, I can name friends of mine in each of those decades, Greeks, who had to leave because of 200% taxes, their own version of the Kristallnacht. And then finally, an iconographer whom I know very well, who left in 1964, and the ever-shrinking community of the Greeks that stayed in Istanbul. My question is for all of you, who polices the Treaty of Lausanne? Who's there checking off? Because it seems to me that the Turkish state just said okay, and then did as they pleased.
There is no police.
Yeah.
League of Nations, at least during the interwar years, was supposed to be the police. I mean, it is written in the text itself that these are problems of international concern, the minority rights, and that they are under the supervision of the League of Nations, which, of course, the Turkish state thinks as a breach of its own sovereignty because it's domestic affairs. Effectively, it deals with its minorities, and these Greeks, for some of you who might not know, some Greeks state, not by coincidence, but the exchange agreement of 1924 exempted the in situ Greeks in Istanbul from the exchange, and some Muslims on the Greek side as well. Yes, I mean, this is a question that we are struggling with. Who checks? Who is out there to check Turkey? I mean, I'm sure Elizabeth, like the way that even during the Russian the beginning of and now in the continuous Russian invasion of Ukraine, Turkey as a NATO power is doing a lot of things, even at the international level, right? Not just domestic policy, internationally too, doing things that it's not supposed to do, but is getting away with it, right? So in terms of that, on the one hand, Hagia Sophia, like the conversion, recent conversion, reconversion of it to a mosque, for instance. I don't have any, my broader, I think, comment about everything that has been said here, that we need real, enforceable, I'm going to say it again, with muscle, a structure that is trans and supranational, that will discipline all of us, really, not into killing each other without any exceptions.
Yeah, I do. I wanted to read you, because I think it's instructive and it speaks to how broken the international system is. We have seen, we're international lawyers, and you're the expert here as a legal historian, we're in the third or fourth generation of international human rights law. And so we have this whole panoply of laws which are meant to address exactly what we're all discussing here. We have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Degrading Treatment of Punishment, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and the Convention relating to the status of refugees. They don't work because there is no international order. There are not commitments to actually enforcing these, to compliance and enforcement. And I think that's the tragedy that we are all confronting here. We have a whole panoply of instruments, but there is no political will, and there's no pressure from the ground up on states to actually enforce the things to which they are signatories. And I don't have a solution for that, but I think that is the tragedy that we're all confronting here. And I would like to add one thing for our consideration. We've been talking a lot about population movements, either voluntary or forced or negotiated. I would wager that most people don't, even when they volunteer to leave, nobody wants to leave their place ever. I mean, who wants to leave their place? But let's say people leave and there are no more people. What is the evidence? What are the physical evidences that those people actually once existed? And that's where I think also the issue of cultural heritage, certainly tangible but intangible heritage practices that go along with those tangible spaces become absolutely important, because the people leave, and if their heritage physicality is gone, that is true memoricide. There is literally no remembering that these people once were. And I think that's something that in the fog of war, but also in post-war negotiations, the issues of heritage need to be more directly and addressed, and there need to be compliance mechanisms for that, because in some cases, that's the only way of remembering a people or one person who belonged to a people that once were.
And I think this really speaks to something that previously mentioned, the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians, and the recent ethnic cleansing of 120,000 people from there by the Azerbaijani government, and now what they are doing with the cultural heritage, also something that they did in the Nakhchivan region before, which I think it's a great, important closing moment that actually, as we speak, some of our references are not just Israel, Hamas, it's not just the Ukrainian war, but also what's going on in the South Caucasus with some of the people, Armenians, that are also implicated in that part of the world.
And the private sector is implicated in that, and the art community and the heritage community. There need to be mechanisms and laws that actually bite for those people who are participating either unknowingly but oftentimes knowingly in acquiring stolen and trafficked property.
This brings us to another, let's say, realm of history and memory. So therefore we are going to we are going to organize another panel discussion about the importance of memory and what is more important, historical fact or how we see them, and whether each generation actually rebrand, if not reshape the history. So I would say we didn't end on a positive note, but I can feel positive feelings, you know. So thank you for your participation, thank you for your questions.